And we're live.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Adityanji, and we are here Friday evening at 9 p.m. under the auspices of International Commission for Human Rights and Religious Freedom for our weekly seminar for the Nanda Fellowship Training Program in Human Rights. Those of the folks who are joining for the first time, this is the logo of International Commission for Human Rights and Religious Freedom. To those folks who are in India, good morning. And I know that there is somebody joining us from India. And good evening to the rest of the folks who are based in US. On behalf of the Board of Directors and the Executive Committee of the ICHRRF, I invite all of you to yet another seminar in the ICHRRF Professor Ved P. Nanda Fellowship Training Program. Our distinguished faculty is chaired by Professor Ved P. Nanda, Professor Yashwant Pathak, Professor Nalini Rao, Professor Lavanya Vemsani, myself, Mr. Clemens, and Mr. Hardam Tripathi, who is going to be faculty preceptor today, Dr. Yashodhan Agolgaonkar, Professor Nidhi Shandurnikar, and Dr. Richard Benkins. Currently, we have two fellows, Mr. Ripudaman Pachauri, who joined in January of 2022, and Anushri Gisard, who joined in July of 2022. Our seminars have a very standard structured format. First 25 minutes, there is a presentation by the fellow. This is followed for a 10 minutes commentary by the chief mentor, Professor Ved Nanda. This is followed by a 25 minutes discussion by the preceptor, the faculty preceptor assigned to the seminar. And last 30 minutes, we have an open question and answer session and discussion. So that has been the standard we have been following. The topic of today's seminar is Black Lives Matter movement and racial bias in targeted killings in the United States. Faculty preceptor is Hardam Tripathi, who is an attorney. He is also Director of Legal and Policy Affairs for the ICHRRF. And our fellow today who is going to make presentation is Mr. Ripudaman Pachauri. A couple of announcements. End of this month, on Sunday, August 28th at 10 a.m. Eastern Day Time, and that would be 7:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time, we will be releasing a report of special hearing on Kashmiri Hindu genocide. This hearing was held on March 27th by a special hearing committee chaired by Professor Ved Nanda. This was a 3-member committee, and the final report is going to be released by Professor Nanda in this special event. We are inviting applications for January 2023 session of fellowship program, and we are inviting volunteer faculty members. Couple of housekeeping rules before we formally start the presentation. We would like all of you to mute yourself to avoid noise interference. Change your cell phone setting to vibration mode. When the fellow or the faculty preceptor are speaking, please don't interrupt them. Those members of the audience who identify themselves openly will be allowed to ask questions. We don't allow anonymous questioners. All the questions have to be sent through the chat function. Questions should be very specific and precise. And we don't want lengthy comments in the form of a lecture or a monologue under the garb of a question. Like our all events, all seminars, this seminar would also...
I cannot hear anyone. Is Adityanji still speaking?
Yes, I'm still speaking. We will be recording this event and it will be available later on our on our YouTube channel. So with that, I will stop this introduction and I will invite Mr. Ripudaman Pachauri to start his presentation. And Ripudaman, you need to unmute yourself. You are currently on mute. Go ahead, Ripudaman.
Thank you, Adityanji. Good evening, Hardamji.
Good evening, sir.
Able to hear me? Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we are able to hear you.
Okay, perfect, perfect. Thank you. So, Black Lives Matter movement and the racial bias in targeted killings and encounters in the United States. I'll start my presentation now. When the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were written, they protected only the rights of white men, in particular white men who owned property. These documents, upon which our government and legal system were founded, did not extend equal rights to women and to Black people, most of them who were enslaved. And the driving force for the creation of formalized police forces in the United States was the desire to monitor and control the movements and the action of slaves, to catch runaways and quash revolts. The disappropriate incarceration of Black people today is grown directly out of that dark history and the brutality of the Jim Crow era. Black people account for 40% of the approximately 2.3 million incarcerated people in US and nearly 50% of all exonerees, despite making up just 13% of the US population. This is in large part because they are policed more heavily, often presumed guilty, and frequently denied a fair shot at justice. The overrepresentation of Black Americans in the nation's justice system is well documented. Black men comprise about 13% of the male population, but about 35% of those incarcerated. Only 1 in 3 Black men born today can expect to be incarcerated in his lifetime, compared to 1 in 6 Latino men and 1 in 17 white men. Black women are similarly impacted. 1 in 18 Black women born in 2001 is likely to be incarcerated sometime in her life, compared to 1 in 111 white women. The underlying reason for this disappropriate representation are rooted in the history of the United States and perpetuated by current practices within the nation's justice system. Understanding the racial bias in shootings by police. Racial bias in police shooting in the United States has been widely noted in the sociological literature for many decades. And there have been many explanation for these kind of police shooting, range from implicit bias in the psychology of individual officers, structural biases established by the existing social order, and proximate responses by the police to areas of high violence and crime. Uh, Racial bias in profiling and encountering suspects, and blatant racism, social dominance orientation, or other factors. With the US PSD and geo-reference data set on racial animus, an additional hypothesis is tested that the police officers embedded in more normatively racist culture contexts shows increased racial bias in killing of unarmed civilians. The motivation for this hypothesis comes from the sociological literature on racial uh, implicit racial bias in rapid responses decision. In the context of frequency dependent and conformist social learning and the inter-ethnic interaction, especially when ethnic superiorly associated with being a threat in the mind of an individual with the structural power, a high social dominance orientation, and little accountability for excessive use of force. Biased policing tools. As technology has advanced, law enforcement agencies have explored its applications to policing, resulting in the use of algorithms that attempt to predict who might be more likely to commit a crime, and facial recognition tools that aim to identify the perpetrators of a crime using image database. These might sound like tools that could make communities safer, but the reality is that they encroach on citizens' privacy rights and endanger Black and Brown people. The algorithms used to predict future crimes are based on historical crime data, and research has found that the racial bias is ingrained in this data because it reflects police activity and arrest rather than the actual crime committed. And those biases get amplified by these algorithms. For example, a risk assessment algorithm may rate a person a high risk for committing another crime, likely garnering them a higher bail because of high arrest rate in their neighborhood. However, the algorithm does not take into consideration that poor communities and communities of color are typically policed more heavily and as a result see more arrest. It also does not factor in the false positive case in which the person was later determined to be innocent, reduced by these large number of arrests. In 2016, ProPublica investigation found that the risk assessment algorithms used in Broward County, Florida, for example, incorrectly predicted that Black defendants would commit future crimes at twice the rate as white defendants. The tool also underestimated white defendants' risk of committing future crimes. Already, tools like facial recognition software have come under fire for racial bias. Studies have found that facial recognition tools are relatively successful at identifying the faces of white males, but falsely identify Black and Asian faces 10 to 100 times more often than they misidentify white faces. Then another reason is the unregulated databases. When developing or identifying suspects, police may rely on blanket surveillance methods like predictive policing databases, including gang or DNA databases for leads. However, who is added to these databases is subject to the unfair discretion of law enforcement officials. The criteria for being added to a gang database vary from place to place, but police can decide to include people in databases based on things like tattoos and past arrests. They can also choose to add people to gang database based on the color of their clothing, their neighborhood, their family, their friends, and even for staying out late. And people of color tend to be overrepresented in these databases. In Portland, where the Black people make just 6% of the population, 64% of the people included in the city gang database were Black, while members of white supremacist gang were underrepresented. In Chicago, 95% of the people who police identified as gang members during arrest were people of color. The New York City chief of detective testified that 99% of the 17,200 people, I'm sorry for that, New York City Chief Detective testified that 99% of 17,200 people in NYPD's gang database in 2080s were people of color. Police are generally not required to inform people that they have been added to a database. And there is a little transparency around how these databases are managed and used. But we do not know that innocent people are swept into these databases and wrongly arrested because of them. In 2016, NYPD arrested about 120 people in Bronx on gang-related charges, but it later turned out that dozens of them were not in gangs. Still, 115 people out of them still entered guilty pleas, with only 2 people choosing to fight for their charges at trial. What data say about the police brutality and racial bias? About 1,000 civilians are killed each year by law enforcement officers in United States. By one estimate, black men are 2.5 times more likely than white men to be killed by police during their lifetime. And in another study, black people who were fatally shot by the police seem to be twice as likely as white people to be unarmed. Benchmarking the relative counts of killing by police on relative crime rates rather than relative population size generates a measure of racial disparity in the use of lethal force that is unbiased by differential crime rates. Their publication, however, lacked any formal derivation showing that their benchmarking methodology has the I'm sorry, my tongue is twisting, statistical properties required to establish such a claim. The casual model of lethal force by police conditional on relative crime rates implicit in their analysis and prove that their benchmarking methodology does not in general remove the bias introduced by the crime rate differences. Instead, it creates strong statistical biases that mask true racial disparities, especially in the killing of unarmed non-criminals by police. Reanalysis of their data using the formal derived criminality correcting benchmarks shows that there is a strong and statistically reliable evidence of anti-Black racial disparities in the killing of unarmed Americans by police. They are now, what data should be analyzed? And more basic question is, it should be asked that in analysis of this data, who shot by police and who was shot, unarmed versus armed person, by race and ethnicity. Ratio of the probability of being black and shot by the police to the probability of being black and unarmed and shot by the police. Ratio of the probability of being Hispanic armed and shot by police and probability of being Hispanic unarmed shot by police, and so on and so forth. There's a need of dragging the attention of policymakers in these issues, and because of many reasons. These biased targeting of people, killing of people, especially Black people, Black communities, Because of these incidents, there is a burden on the health system. Healthcare co-workers and doctors must register their protests. There's a burden on economy of the country. So the mathematicians and the scientists who are basically developing or who should be developing the better algorithms to help the system should also register their protest. Um, so as the people in the community, all the community members, uh, because of the social unrest, loss of jobs, loss of time, money, and peace, everyone should be concerned and register their protest. Now, a little about the because of these incidents, there's a long history of Black movements. Since 1614, there have been some sort of resistance or the movements or protests registered by the Black communities. I will just name a couple of them, like the Civil War, underground railroad system that was basically to help the Black people to escape from slavery, Montgomery bus boycott, Selma to Montgomery March, and lately Black Lives Matter. I'll quickly cover, and I have three, like about 4 minutes maybe. I'll quickly cover the history of Black Life Matters. Uh, there was an outraged and saddened after the acquittal of George Zimmerman, the Florida man who killed a Black teenager in 2012 in Oakland, California, resident. Um, I'm sorry. So there are multiple people. So Florida man who killed a Black teenager in 2012, and in Oakland, California, resident Alicia Garza protest a message on Facebook on July 13, 2013. And in her post, she had this phrase "Black Lives Matters," which soon becomes rally rallying cry and movement throughout the United States and around the world. As the hashtag become popular on Facebook and Twitter, Garza Kullers and fellow activist Opal Tomati built a network of community organizers and racial justice activists using the name Black Lives Matter. The phrase and the hashtag were then quickly adopted by grassroots activists and protests all over the country, particularly after the subsequent killing of Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and a number of other African Americans at the hands of police officers or would-be vigilantes like Zimmerman. Simple and clear in its demand for Black dignity, the phrase became one of the major symbols of the protest that erupted after Brown's killing in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. And that is very close to the place that I live, like maybe 3-4 miles from where I live. And then Black Lives Matters as an organization, a global network was founded in 2013 in response of acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murder. Black Lives Matter is a movement whose mission is to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilantes. By combating and countering acts of violence, creating space of Black imagination and innovation and centering Black joy. They are winning immediate improvements in the lives of Black people. Now, like other previous Black movements, this movement was also in talk. However, at different point of times, this particular movement was also exploited by many individuals and organizations. Like there were a lot of online scammers um, who exploited this moment. Then tech industry is also still exploiting Black Lives Matter movement. Like Twitter, they also even changed their logo to Black Flying Bird. There were cases and allegations that Black BLM leaders get rich by exploiting their community, and the money that came for donation were used by purchasing houses and the cars and other expensive items. The corporations, there were many list of huge list of corporations who basically took this as an opportunity. Like Netflix, they had their own genre of Black Lives Matters movies related to it. Reebok, they showed in a study, they showed Black people are more into sports, and so that would basically help in selling their products. Same with there's a company which was in the beauty products like eyeliners and all, IQ. Their artificial intelligence algorithm found that people like eyes of women who are darker in color more, and like about 125% more their posts are more liked and watched than a white model. So they also exploited this particular movement on the social media and created within the organization, they created these kind of open talks related to these movements. And there's a huge list of Ben and Jerry and Orel, which is again a cosmetic product company. So yeah, so that is pretty much from my side, Adityanji. There are many aspects of it. There's a political aspect to it as well. The movement was also supported by the external entities, the left political parties and other parties. They also supported the related basically movements that were going on to basically put pressure on the current government as well. So there are a lot of aspects to it, but the bottom line is there's been a long history of biased police brutality and control and social unjust against the Black community in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ripudaman, for a very informative presentation, buttressed with data and current, prevailing social trends, reviewing both aspects of the problem. We are very fortunate that Professor Vednanda is present here today. So we will request Professor Vednanda for his expert commentary. Professor Vednanda, please.
Thanks, Adityanji. Ripudamanji, it was very exhaustive, it was pretty comprehensive, and you have vividly presented what has happened about racially motivated police brutality, and that remedies have not been forthcoming in the United States. As a human rights attorney or human rights advocate, you know that each state is obligated to provide effective remedies. And those remedies are both procedural and then substantive. And procedural would be that there is a tribunal that can listen to you, you have a day in the court, and then you have effective remedies. And you can argue, and you did that, that the United States has not been able to provide that justice. Question that I want to ask you is that once the US has not been able to do that, where do you go internationally? Because once you are not provided that justice at home, then is there any international avenue that you can seek, that you can explore? And I'll assist you, but kindly just give some thought, and you may not have given a whole lot of time to it, and that's all right, that's fine. But can you think of any possibility where you can go internationally for it?
Well, Human Rights Commission is there. We can raise their our
You mean
they-
Human
they-
Rights
they-
Council?
Human Rights Council. They have a meeting, I think 2 or 3 times a year, where all the activists come and discuss their problems and raise their concerns. Uh, we that
But
is one place.
they don't give any remedy. Is there any tribunal? Is there any setting in which you can get effective remedy?
Well, it also depends on what kind of issue. For example, if it's a labor issue, it can be raised in UN
You know,
labor
it's racial
organization.
police brutality.
Mhm.
You mentioned Eric Garner.
Yeah.
And just take the Eric Garner's case.
Mhm.
Loose cigarettes, based upon that, police comes after him, then in a choke, and he says almost dozen times, 11 times, I can't breathe.
Right.
And so I think that is the kind of setting, and nothing really happens. So can you go internationally? And here I want
I
you to
doubt
kindly
I
think
doubt
about it.
about it because it's an internal matter of state. So I really doubt.
No, internal matters, as you know, Ripudamanji, that's exactly where you go to the international setting. Once you have exhausted the local remedies, then you have the opportunity to go internationally. And I think the point I wanted to make for you, and please look into it carefully and sometime, that the United States, in the United States, since we're talking about the US, avenues are very, very limited. We're not party to the International Criminal Court. We can't go there. We can't go at the present time to the World Court because only states can go there. And there is no other tribunal. But you have the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights and Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And kindly just give some thought to it that we are not a party to the American Convention on Human Rights. We are not even a party to that treaty. Under that treaty, you can take the case to the Inter-American Commission. So what do? The United States still can go to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights because the United States is a member of the Organization of American States. OAS has a declaration, and declaration is on the rights and duties of man. Under that Declaration on Rights and Duties of Man, there are the same provisions as in the convention. So you can go to that commission And I have got several cases here. I can send them to you if you want to.
Yeah, that would
Those
be nice.
cases,
Yeah.
I'll send them to you. That commission hasn't taken cases from the United States, and you can go to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. I simply wanted to mention that to you so that you might kindly explore it. There are other things that I can say, but there is no need to, because we'll have today our preceptor. He's going to be talking with you, and you have done wonderful work. So thank you. Thank you, Aditya. I'll stop
Thank you,
here.
Professor Nanda, for highlighting the limited options citizens of United States have about a systemic bias in police brutalities, ending in actually loss of life of minority citizens from a country that champions the cause of human rights all over the world, uh, believes in thumping the desk and beating the chest by USCIRF, uh, publishing country-specific reports about several countries in the world, but does not investigate domestically what is happening. And I think in that sense, Professor Nanda highlighted that whether at the state level or federal level, the options are very limited for bringing justice. United States has not entered into force or ratified or even agreed to sign a number of human rights conventions internationally, except for the ones Professor Nanda mentioned. So that was, some limited recourse available to citizens of United States if domestic, procedures do not give due process to the victims and survivors. Very limited scope. So we are very thankful to Professor Nanda for that bit of information. At least I feel that my level of education in the area has been, increased because I did not know about that particular option. So it's my job now to invite from a senior attorney to a junior attorney, the faculty preceptor for today's seminar, Mr. Hardam Tripathi Esquire. As I said earlier, Mr. Tripathi is the Director of Legal and Policy Affairs for International Commission of Human Rights, and he's the faculty preceptor. So we would like to have around 20-25 minutes discussion on this topic from Mr. Hardam Tripathi. Hardam, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you so much, sir. And I want to just start off by saying, Dr. Nanda, it's really an honor and pleasure that you're here again today. I always learn so much more about international human rights when you're around. And you're a wealth of knowledge. You're very seasoned in this, and we all appreciate you being here. And Dr. Arindianji as well, sir, thank you for always organizing, and Mr. Clemens for the focus of the topics today. And finally, you, Mr. Ripudaman, you've done an excellent job. You put a lot of time and effort into this. There were a lot of topics that we could go on about these kind of issues as it relates to BLM, as Black Lives Matter, or racial bias as it relates to police killings in the United States. So today, I know we only have about a very brief amount of time for my perspective of it for 25 minutes. And so I will make it very succinct as I can, and I welcome the opportunity to have this discussion. So first of all, thank you to ICHRRF, and thank you for all the seasoned old heads here that are willing to provide us further guidance for us young people who can always learn a little bit more every time we're here. So thank you so much. Just to kind of start off, I'm going to split up my time very evenly between the Black Lives Matter movement versus the racial bias that does exist in this country. What I know is obviously from my experience working as a U.S. immigration attorney, dealing with ICE and the Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the federal level, and killings you probably don't hear about as much versus the state killings you do. Also working for federal law enforcement agencies like the DEA or the ATF or the U.S. Department of Justice, and even in this great state of Florida, working with Attorney General Moody when I was her law clerk. and also being on the other side as a federal defender's office aide and things of that nature, and being at the state attorney's office. So my perspective is going to be very balanced. It's going to come as a minority, as a man who comes from India, a supporter of law enforcement, and also someone who understands the plight of minorities who go through systemic racism. And, our history has shown that. One thing I really want to cover today is not only just the history and all that, but the mental health issues that could be related, the drug interdiction, the public advocacy efforts, all of it. Something Professor Nanda brought up was about procedural issues versus substantive issues. I wish we had so much more time to go into the legal, conversation about it, Fourth Amendment rights, Terry stop and frisk, all these kind of things that do play a role in all these efforts, which I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of great questions by with Professor Nanda and Dr. Arindenji and even Mr. Clemens. I'm sure I see Professor Nanda smiling there because he's listening in, and he knows these issues are very much like an onion. There's multiple layers, and it's hard to talk about it in 25 minutes. So I will make this very succinct. Yes, we talked about procedural aspects and tribunal rights and substantive rights and effective remedies and things of that nature. We also talked briefly about the international avenue of where we go next as Americans or those listening in from India or other countries around the world. What do you do to get redress, right? Under equal protection clauses, each country does have those. The UN has it. There's sentencing guideline commissions. We haven't even talked about. We could have a whole conversation today about just commissions alone, both from a state and local perspective, all the way up to the federal and international perspective. So it's very bicameral in nature. It's very multifaceted, and we'll talk about that. Just as I was listening to Mr. Ripudaman today, I got an alert that I saw something where a firefighter lost his job today for an anti-police rant that he made, and you hear about this all the time, But I'm going to start off with some emotional feel. We're going to talk about Black Lives Matter. I'm going to say a quote. What are you following me for? You can literally hear that quote. That was Trayvon Martin. You know what happened to that case? Zimmerman got acquitted. Please don't let me die. Kamani Gray. I can't breathe. Eric Garner, something that you brought up, Mr. Ripudaman. Also, Freddie Gray. And then, Officer Daniel, who was actually in charge of that, no criminal charges were filed. And this kind of goes into the effect of all about political influence, a lot about what's going on in the country. You have judges who are certain parties. You have public advocacy going on. This all happened during Barack Obama's presidency. When he was president, talking about Trayvon. I can bring up quotes all day. I don't have a gun. Stop shooting. That was Michael Brown. That happened when he got killed in St. Louis in a suburb, Ferguson, Missouri, for stealing allegedly cigarillos from a corner store. And guess what? Officer Dan Wilson shot him. He died, and Officer Wilson was acquitted. They tased me. That was Walter Scott. Ahmaud Arbery, jogger in Georgia. They finally faced murder charges. So with Black Lives Matter, I only got 6 minutes left to kind of talk about this specific section, but I'm going to explain in 6 minutes kind of the history of what happened with Black Lives Matter from when they started to where it is now. It started from "Why are you following me for?" to "I can't breathe, officer. You have a knee on my neck" with George Floyd. And the "Get your knee off our necks" was what Black Lives Matter ultimately ended up doing. They've been founded as an organization since 2013. Mr. Ripudaman, you actually talked about the grassroots efforts. You talked about the social and political group that it is and the founders of it, and we're going to talk about that. So you gave a lot of statistics. I'm not going to talk about statistics today because today I want to kind of talk about what Mr. Clemens actually brought up when him and I had a discussion about this matter. We're going to talk about what is the systemic discrimination about? What's the history? What are the current challenges? What are the new improvements in the rule of law or within our society? What are the new minorities that are now getting affected by it? And what are the future prospects? I know that's a lot to say in the next 5 minutes as I discuss Black Lives Matter, and also the next 7 or 8 minutes that I have on the other half. But basically, Black Lives Matter started because it started after Trayvon Martin. That happened back in February 2012 in my state, my great state of Florida. It's in I live in Lakeland, but this happened in Sanford, about an hour and 20 minutes away, by a gentleman named George Zimmerman. He was someone who literally made a police call. These are records you can basically ask for as citizens if you want to create actual change. We can all sit here in a group and learn about all these things, but how do we actually create positive change? You can see something very beautiful even here. We have Professor Nanda, who's very seasoned. We have someone like Mr. Clemens, who's who's someone in his prime, and then you have young people as well, like myself and Mr. Ripudaman. This is generational. This is things that we have to continue chipping away at. And I think Professor Vanda and Dr. Arindanji have, started this movement, to talked about it, gotten us all together. But you have to really understand that history. The police told this man not to follow. It's not police protocol. He still followed. Mr. Zimmerman did. Followed a 17-year-old, shot him. Said he shot Martin in self-defense. Was arrested 44 days later. That brought national attention. Petitions were signed by more than 1 million people. Even Obama said that if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon. There was a national outcry. Ultimately, what ended up happening was it was a new civil rights movement with humanitarian implications in this era, with social media, with all these things that go on. So we had back in the day, maybe in Mr. Nanda's time or Dr. Adityanji's time, James Baldwin, MLK. These are people who started it. And now we had people like Patrice Cullors, who started that hashtag Black Lives Matter on Twitter. We have people like Opal Tometi, who started the platform, social media platforms to connect activists. We had Alicia Garza that Mr. Ripudaman talked about, who was kind of the original founder and activist who kind of did it all, and kind of brought it together. The Black Lives Matter hashtag was used 50,000 times. They wanted to do a lot of things. Reverend Al Sharpton got involved. He took the mantle. There was a lot of anti-police stances. So you got to look at kind of the back and forth. They were consent decrees that were in place, consent decrees for those who aren't lawyers or who want to know more about it. It basically gave courts, right, the authority to basically overrule local police departments. You saw a lot of civil rights abuses in cities like Boston and in states like Missouri or rural areas. You saw limited military-grade weapons, stances being used. You saw practice and pattern investigations, discriminatory policing being investigated. There's also this legal concept that I'm sure Professor Nanda is going to talk about maybe a little later. It's called qualified immunity. There was a legal doctrine out there that protected officers of the court or police from persecution, retribution. Qualified immunity was a state level thing, but it ended up becoming a federal issue. See, today police are actually protected by union contracts where, it protects their jobs. They are usually, with my experience alone working in the state attorney's office, we have seen that state attorneys, prosecutors usually work with, or federal prosecutors work with the FBI, work with the, ICE officers, agents, or at the state level work with the police officers. And you know what? It created a whole separate thing. And I think Mr. Ripudaman brought it up at the very end about politics. Well, they said no justice, no peace, for the Black Lives Matter chants. You had, it wasn't acceptable. There was a backlash. And then it created partisanship. It created sides of the government from policy perspectives, from social perspectives, from people who had money, who did not have money, corporations versus anti-corporate. You saw companies like Disney and all that, like you just talked about, Ripudaman, that went, very much in their own way. And, and then Trump won because of the backlash. And Giuliani was saying that, all lives matter and, Asian lives matter, Hispanic lives matter. And it created, nationalism. Then you had what happened in Charlottesville, Virginia. You had counter-protesters fighting white nationalists fighting counter-protesters with tiki torches, and all that. Then you saw, the media inflame it. So we got to also talk about what is the role of the media. Soon after that, violent crimes hit a 16-year high in 2018. 4,500 or more violent crimes, right, happened under Obama's watch. After Trump came in, that happened. Then there was black on black crime that happened in Chicago. That was the counter argument that was being used. There was a booming economy under Trump and record low unemployment for blacks in 2019 for 5.4%. So now Black Voices for Trump came out, and then arguments started happening with Black Lives Matter, and there was fighting. And now we have Biden. So it's been a whole history of Black Lives Matter that's been, I think, for the books. No matter what side of the aisle you're on, we all agree as humanitarians and people who respect people that human rights matter and lives matter, but Black Lives Matter or Hispanic lives matter, or whatever you want to call it. They all said that blacks claimed that COVID, unemployment, hard times, all were bad for blacks and Hispanics and Asians and whatever you want to call it. But basically, we got to look at it at one point or perspective. George Floyd who was a 46-year-old man at the time, he got shot. He allegedly used a forged $20 bill, you know, and for that he had a knee on his neck and he died. And because of that, you've seen the brother of George Floyd say that he was a martyr. You know, his name was Philanese Floyd. That's the brother. You had congressional hearings. You had 4 officers who were convicted after multiple protests, some of which were minorities themselves, Asian. You know, and then it created this nationalism and the sentiment, which is now being used for 2022 midterm elections in 2024. And then you have antagonists like Ben Carson, Tim Scott, Jerome Adams, who was the U.S. Surgeon General. And you just literally on the other side had Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson just get put on the Supreme Court. So ultimately, you're seeing the kind of the history of Black Lives Matter, what happened, what was the point of it, what did we learn from it, and all of that. So that's just real quick. That's my first half of it. The next half will be pretty short because I want to open up the floor for questions. Now, because Mr. Ripudaman just actually talked about all of it. There has been systemic discrimination in this country. We know that. Stats back it. Many different private individuals have done their research. Others have done it from professional NGOs and whatnot. Basically, the consensus is based on the research from universities and, you know, like Harvard and any other university you can think of. If you're Black, you got about a 3.5 times higher chance of getting shot. And the reason why is, and that's not taking into Black officers shooting white, you know, civilians, or Black officers shooting Black victims, or white officers shooting and white victims and all that. So we're just talking about white on Black kind of thing at this moment, and what's the future. So basically 3.5 times higher if you're Black. There is a bias. It's called implicit bias, and we should probably have a psychologist on this board right now talking about it, because that could be its own separate session. Basically, we've all been there, I think, you know, implicit bias. I'm not saying I'm perfect. I'm not saying anyone here who's listening in is perfect. But I've heard of stories where we have heard, and especially culturally speaking, you know, if you pass a large Black man on the side of the street and you're a young white lady, you're probably, you know, I've heard that they clutch their purse more, or that they lock their door in their car, you know, as some person who may be homeless who comes by who's Black versus white. These are all examples of implicit bias. I'm not saying that it's good or bad. I'm saying it's really bad. We all have it. It's human nature. A psychologist would probably have to explain that part of it. But basically, that's an example of implicit bias. That's where Mr. Ripudaman came up with this whole, conversation today with the team here and everyone else listening in. That there is a history of it. It's systemic. It's psychological. I think it's cultural. It's how you were raised by family. All this has been tested by many different groups, many different organizations, and all of it. So that's the systemic discrimination part. We all know it exists. We all know it's an issue. We should talk about it and fix it. But how do we fix it is ultimately the end of this conversation. And I know I only have about a few more minutes left, so I'm going to continue going here. The current challenges that we're facing is that, you know, there's been simulations done by a lot of, agencies. I myself went to a mayoral academy with a woman who's actually calling in today, who actually works in a corporation as well as a future lawyer. And she sees it too, and a lot of us see it day to day. But there were simulations that I had to go through. And I remember walking through doors, and I remember, maybe it's because I was of Indian descent or Asian descent, but I remember we looked at implicit bias in our simulation, and we saw that the people who are of white, color, they were quicker to shoot those who happen to be Black rather than those who happen to be white, even though they were unarmed. And so, you know, the data shows what it shows, and it can be interpreted in many ways, partisanly speaking, or from a scientific method perspective, or whatever you want to put it. But they were quicker to shoot if they were Black than white. Now I'm going to quickly go in because I only got about 4 more minutes left, so I'm going to wrap this up. New improvements. There's been more genetic and DNA testing in science. That's something that's been was not around in the 70s and 80s as it is now. The way we can put genomes together now and all that, it's just so much more advanced. FBI is using it, law enforcement is using it, and private agencies who hold law enforcement accountable, and lobbyists and NGOs and politicians, they're all using it. So there's genetics and DNA testing. There's also this argument at the state level, because police function, police powers is a 10th Amendment issue. It's a state issue. And ultimately, it's all about, you know, the powers of the state and the 10th Amendment under the 14th Amendment clause. And we can talk about all that later. But basically, body-worn cameras, de-escalation trainings, implicit bias trainings. We're talking about banning of chokeholds in certain jurisdictions, early intervention programs. We're talking about even reform of force policies, deadly force versus force that could be, used less. Because of these policies, there's been on average, based on my research of this topic, about a 21% drop of involved shootings involving minorities. There's also computational language tools, apps being created, technology to analyze the language and tone used by officers on suspects, and they're able to tell the race of the suspect by the way the officer's tone and language is. The reason for the stop, asking for certain documents, the Terry frisk, all of it. So scripts were used differently for whites compared to blacks. Reasons were given earlier for whites, while blacks were sometimes not given reasons. There was respect given to certain, whites more compared to blacks. Mannerisms, body language on camera, how particular words were being used, hands on the wheel, for example, these kind of things. So there's a whole conversation. We could have a whole video on this together. But I'm going to keep moving because I only got now about 1 or 2 more minutes. So I'm going to wrap this up. New minorities. Who are the new victims now? Who are the new scapegoats? Every generation has scapegoats. Jews when we were in World War II. The Uyghurs right now, who are the minority Muslim populations in China. There's always a scapegoat in every generation. The new minorities now that we are seeing is Native Americans, tribal populations, indigenous populations. They do not have the same rights. I'm actually getting barred in tribal court. I'm seeing it every day. Also forgotten minorities, and also Latinos. There's a whole immigration stance right now. Just something came about, and I'm an immigration attorney by trade, and that's what I do. We have seen immigrants, specifically Latinos, who are going through immigration and border public perceptions and things of that nature. They're the new minority. They're the new black now for this future generation because of the anti-immigration stance and whatnot. And then finally, what are future prospects looking like? And I'm going to say this in less than 1 minute. Ultimately, reform is happening, policy changes are happening, congressional oversight, better training, I think, in different departments. That's just a perspective I bring based on being both sides of the aisle. Better data collection. You're seeing a public outcry. You're seeing public advocacy. You're seeing more accountability. You're seeing independent review boards. You're seeing consent decrees being passed by governors who want to get reelected, yes, but also want to protect people. You're seeing open investigation into localized police unions. You're seeing the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice investigating police units in more rural areas. You're seeing police reform measures themselves within their departments. And ultimately, you're seeing an outcry of people who ultimately want to be advocates for those who all want to live life. I'm going to end it with this. At the end of it, yes, it is involving racial disparity, but at the end of the day, we're all human. We all believe in the same things. We want to do better for our families, and we want to be protected, and public safety and all of that is very important. So at the end of the day, I think we have a positive future ahead as it relates to this. You're seeing a lot of great things happening in the future. I think the future is bright. I may say that as a young man, but I'm sure Professor Nanda, Dr. Enderji, and Mr. Clemens will probably ask me some great questions about it. Because I always think the future is bright, but you know what? You never know. Nothing beats history, and these gentlemen that are about to ask me these questions have a lot more knowledge about and have lived longer to do it all. And I always think, because I'm young and stupid sometimes, that the future is bright. But at the end of the day, I do think it can happen. I think there is more technology these days, and I think there's just a public advocacy outcry to do better, not because of a race, but because we're all humans living on in this one world. And I think it's just really great. So thank you so much, ICHRRF. Thank you so much to our listeners viewing in today. Thank you so much to our seasoned board members here who are here. And ultimately, thank you, Ripudaman, who actually you gave us such a great preface. So not only do we understand what I talked about, which was the outcomes, the future, and all that, but in order to understand that, you really do have to understand the history and the stats. So thank you, and really appreciate it. And I welcome any and all questions, and I look forward to having more listeners on with our meetings. So thank you so much.
Hardam, before even Adityanji comes, because I shouldn't interrupt, but I need to tell you that unless I was a perennial optimist, I couldn't continue teaching international law. So thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Hardam, for a very eloquent presentation. We have time for discussion and question and answer. Since we have our other fellow Anushri joining us, and she put a question through the chat function. We are a small group, and I would like Anushri to ask the question herself. While Professor Nanda is here, he's usually short of time, so I want to give chance to Anushri first. Anushri, you have the chance to ask your question.
Adityanji, I'll stay for that question. And my apologies because at 8 o'clock there is another program I have to go to, but I'll wait for the question and I'll want to listen. Thank you.
Okay. Anushri, please go ahead.
Namaskar, Professor Vednanda ji. So, Ripudaman ji, thank you so much for that informative presentation. So, you have talked about the targeted killings of Black community in USA. I would just like to know regarding this protest which happened during Black Lives Matter. Is there any concrete proof that the federal government might have deliberately, in a way, disrupted the entire global Black Lives Matter movement by like selectively picking up on the protesters of the Black Lives Matter movement?
I'm not sure about that. Globally, they cannot do, I guess, but yeah, internally it could happen. There have been, Tripathi ji was also mentioning there were a lot of politics. There were, white supremacist groups versus the black groups, and there were armed protests and all. But I do not know or don't have any proof that the federal government disrupt the protest in a systematic way.
Let's have Professor Nanda expand.
No, Adityanji, I'll listen to Tripathi ji.
Okay.
Dr. Nanda, way to put me on
And
the
then
spot.
I'll
I love
leave.
it. No, thank you so much, sir. And Miss Anushri, thank you so much for your question. See, this is a very important question. I'm going to answer it very carefully because I want to make sure we keep it very open-ended, because we all know what the answer is to that question. In any government in the world or any sort of country, there's always things that go on behind the scenes. These are all groups that are backed, and this is public record, by a paper trail, by money. And that's a whole other conversation for another day that we're not going to bring up here in this human rights setting, because everyone kind of has an agenda per se, depending on these kind of movements. And the reason I say that is not because I think sometimes they forget about what they started for or what different groups. The whole movement is a great movement. The government wants to help people and all of that, right? But at the end of it, to ask, was the government behind 9/11? Things like that. Those are all questions you're going to get in very much environmental settings in universities. But to tell you the honest truth, if you actually are involved in politics, you go into lobbying, you get involved in a world of people who know things that have clearances and things of that nature, you are going to start to learn that all these things have, very logical, common sense resolutions. It's just people do not sometimes go to resolve those based on their agenda at times. And so, to ask your question, how are you, as a leader of, allegedly as a Black Lives Matter leader, starting this for people who are Black, but then living in a neighborhood that is all white and taking tax money? Or how can you be on the other side as secret agent or special agents in the federal government, supposed to give our taxpayer dollars to pay for these civil rights initiatives, but then based on what president you get, based on the people who vote for that president, allegedly also, and things like that, how does that affect the laws that are passed, the state and local elections that matter? I always say people always, they think local, but they act global, and vice versa. So you're going to start seeing things where our actions justified the way they are, and our governments being involved, and are there geopolitical issues also present? And I know I have a perspective on it, but Dr. Arindinji and Dr. Nanda, if you'd like to chip in, this would be interesting, because I've seen it as an American lawyer in DC from a lobbying and all that side. And I see both sides of it now, but I do not see it from an international scope that you, Professor Nanda, or Dr. Arindinji may have seen. So could be wrong on a lot of it from my perspective, but what I see, Miss Anushri, is that It is very prevalent, and it's all about the media, and they all get involved, and that's how we, as the people who listen, who are not surrounded by intellectuals such as Dr. Nanda or Dr. Anandaji, would never know. So it's very complicated and convoluted, but that's my perspective of it.
Let's
Excellent answer. And my apologies, I've got to leave. And another day, I'll be able to talk about it too.
Thank you, Professor Nanda.
Thank you.
I would love to hear it, Dr. Nanda. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nanda.
Thank you.
There are no other questions in the chat function. So maybe we will invite people to make any comments. And I know there is a very young paralegal who has joined today for the first time in seminar, Nishant Kardani. Nishant, do you have any comments, questions, or observations on these topics? And feel free to ask any question. Don't feel shy or inhibited because you are joining us for the first time. We encourage very open discussion.
Yes, sir. It was very I mean, it was a lot to go over. So I've never done anything like this before. So I do appreciate you giving me the time to ask the questions. But like I said, I it was just very hard to keep up with everyone because everyone knows so much, and I'm just learning.
Well, you may not have questions. If you have any comments or observations on the topic, again, I don't want you to withhold things. Just don't feel shy that you are the youngest one or you are the first time here.
Yes, sir.
Sometimes those observations and comments are much more pertinent.
No, I agree. I very much agree with you. It's just this was my first meeting, and you are all very professional and very knowledgeable in all these topics, and I am like I said, I'm very new to this, so it's a bit overwhelming.
Okay, okay.
You'll do just fine, Mr. Kardani. Get to know us. We're all very good.
Feeling overwhelmed on the first attendance in a seminar like this should not be a deterrent for future attendance. I will encourage you to come and join us.
Oh, I will always be in every meeting. Trust me. I don't want to miss any of these meetings.
Okay, okay. Carl, do you have any comments?
Namaste, Dr. Avinji. I think that was, I learned a lot today. I think Hardam really touched on a whole bunch of topics really quick and giving me a lot to think about, as well as Ripudaman. And I think Professor Vednanda really has got me thinking on that angle, that not just within America, but try to look at it from as a global movement. And I had a couple of questions about that. I mean, here I've lived in several cities across the United States, but while I've met and had colleagues, African American colleagues who are upwardly mobile, really in DC is the first place where I interact with a stable who've been through college for at least a couple of generations, and so it's a whole different vibe, and in that sense, I also feel quite hopeful for the future. The other thing in DC one finds is a lot of new first-generation immigrants from Africa, and they have a very different socio-economic profile than the typical African Americans who were brought here as slaves. Well, the question I had was, when the Black Civil Rights Movement was really took off, Malcolm X and everything, we saw that Malcolm X went to Africa and tried to put pressure on the United States from Africa. He went to the Organization of African Unity, which was putting pressure on South African apartheid, but they seemed unwilling to say anything to the United States. But then later on, Tanzania took up his cause, and a couple of other African countries spoke up. I was wondering what the status is today with African Americans, not new first generation immigrants, but old African Americans, whether they have developed those relationships with African countries. I mean, we see that, for instance, with Muslim communities, where real or perceived Islamophobia, you find that the Islamic world speaks out very forcefully about it. in other countries, both East and West. Is there something similar that is happening with Black Lives Matter movement in terms like geopolitical leverage using that towards their cause?
Hardam, you want to answer that?
Yes, sir. I actually know a little bit about it because it's very interesting. As an immigration lawyer, I actually, do help a lot of people from Africa, like West Africa, North Africa, South Africa, even. You see a lot of people move here, and I actually always ask them a question. I go, "What's going on politically over there? What's going on, geopolitically?" Like, and these are very smart people. They're very business oriented. They're wanting to get visas, green cards, things like that. And from the other side of it, you also see, what's going on politically over there just by listening and traveling and seeing it yourself. But to answer your question, I want you to direct me to a very unique part of it. Repeat the question and talk about the specific part you want me to address one more time so I can tell you.
Yeah, have present day African American organizations, have they cultivated links with African countries in a way that those countries would speak up on their behalf for the challenges they face in the diaspora?
Yeah, so absolutely. And you know what they're doing? They're using social media. And these are not only African countries who are leaders, and obviously elections change and things like that. There's a lot of strife going on in Africa. But the way it's all about now is its connectivity. And Black Lives Matter has actually become an international movement and organization. I can speak personally from it. I was just in Italy about a month ago, like less than a month, and I was in Pisa, and I saw something spray painted in Italy that said, hashtag Black Lives Matter. And I was on a tour bus as I saw it as an American looking at that, and I said, wow, it's here. It's even here in Italy. And then, so I asked the tour guy, I said, what are all these graffiti things? And just because, I'm involved in immigration and people of different ethnicities and all that, he told me, yes, because of social media and everyone has now more internet than they used to and things like that. Now there's social groups being created. There's now, in the diaspora of it, you're seeing people that you would never think. You have people in South Korea who are saying Black Lives Matter, and the same person in Senegal and the same person in Denmark all being on the same Reddit or being on the same GroupMe or being on the same WhatsApp or being on the same Facebook group. And they are now better able to coordinate. And then you have the world leaders who are sponsoring it as a result and providing funding and all the other things that come with it. It's becoming a very connected international community. And it's to a point where even if you do your research, you're now seeing in suburban San Diego, young white women, you find more members of young white women who are in Black Lives Matter than you find actually blacks themselves. And if you do, you're also seeing another movement of people coming from places like Nigeria and South Africa who are very established and successful businessmen and women who now are capitalistic and more about individual rights and freedoms as an independent American versus those actually saying that they're part of a whole generational conflict as African Americans. So you're seeing political classes, economic classes, and all of them creating partisanship. At the same time, each of those different groups are connecting together socially on social media channels, and no matter what part of the world, they can see each other through Zoom, Teams, and WebEx, and they can also communicate. And they're now more organized, they're getting more funded, and they're doing better advocacy for each of their parts. So very
Thank you,
impressive
Hardam.
stuff.
Carl, do you have any other observations, or this was the only one?
And I hope I answered your
This was the
question,
only
Mr.
one.
Clemens.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I see that too. I was just wondering whether there's any kind of some kind of institutional lobby groups
Yes.
from those countries.
And I will send those to you in an email and send it out to the whole membership here that is wanting to get involved and advocate for whatever they believe in, which is a right that's afforded internationally. I would be more than happy to actually send out that to the group.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so we had very good discussion, very good presentation by Ripudaman, followed by an excellent commentary by Professor Nanda, Attorney Tripathi, and some great questions. I will try to close this within the time and give some observations. I think it is beyond doubt that there is systemic, institutional, racial bias against the black citizens of this country at every sphere. Let's be very frank, at every sphere, whether that is local government, whether that is schools, whether that is, police, whether that is, any other institution, there is a systematic bias that results in finger pointing at black citizens more than the white citizens. There is no doubt about it. Usually, if you see the arguments of the police, their argument is that the black community is disproportionately involved in criminality. That is their standard argument. Is that true? Nobody can answer. Police will say that disproportionately more African American males are incarcerated because they are committing more crimes. But then you look at the level of crimes committed and similar level of crimes committed by a white person, the black offender gets disproportionately higher punishment. So there are grades of truth rather than absolute black and white kind of things. Unfortunately, involvement of black community in criminality may be an epiphenomenon of class effect. That they are all coming from poor homes and poor these things. But besides class, there may be other socio-cultural biases or socio-cultural practices that are unmasking criminal behavior. And I think we need to be understanding that, not with a view to finger pointing, but with a view to solving the problem. There was a gentleman by name Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who at one point in time US ambassador to India. And what Daniel Patrick Moynihan predicted was the end of the black family. And he based it on initial trends, because what was happening with the welfare state being established, the role of fatherhood disappeared from the African American community. So you did not need actually fathers to raise children because state was there. State was the ultimate provider. You can have children. The children would be looked after by the state because you would have so-called food stamps, which are called SNAP now, and other cash benefits, this benefit, that benefit. And it led to actually dissolution of the African American family structure. An African American community became mainly matriarchal without any moderating influences on the African American male. So there's a very complex socioeconomic phenomenon going on if you want to look at as a sociobiologist or a socioanthropologist looking at the whole society dispassionately. So we are seeing actually a whole community being, pushed into chaotic directions because of various political forces and all, in which African American males do not take responsibility for their children. And that's a fact. And when children do not get enough guidance, they indulge in petty, infractions. And if they are not checked, one infraction leads to the other and leads to a trail of a career that brings them into conflict with the law. So there is some onus on the society that needs to be looked into to correct this situation. That is the other part, but still, does it behoove the government at every level to systemically kill young males belonging to a particular community for something like, selling a loose cigarette, or a 12-year-old boy, Tamir Rice in Cleveland, playing with a gun, a toy gun. Unfortunately, the police officer who shot him was rehired in another police precinct in the state of Pennsylvania. So when your hiring practices are such that somebody who was involved in killing of a child for no provocation at all, just using a toy gun, playing with a toy gun in the open, I think it says a lot. So we say all the police departments are, locally hired and all. But as a country, there needs to be some national standards, there needs to be state standards, and they need to be rectified. The biases have to be corrected despite your political agenda, because you are not a civilized country if you continue to behave in this manner and kill 1,000 young males every year just because they happen to be of a different color. So the onus lies on US government, from presidency to Congress to judiciary to local police department to civil society. And the epitome of this bias is the Karen syndrome. I hope all of you know what is a Karen and what is a Karen syndrome. That tells you of the implicit bias. The Central Park bird watcher, Mr. Cooper, was threatened by a Wall Street executive, Karen Amy Cooper, that I am going to call the police and tell them that this African American is threatening my life.
Yeah.
So you have a societal bias where despite education, the biases persist. Are there no counter biases? There are counter biases also. There's white racism and there's black racism. And both are equally guilty. And I think if this problem has to be resolved, racism of any kind has to be eliminated. What we are seeing anthropologically is the evolution of a caste system in the United States. There's a very de facto caste system. People here, talk about other countries where there's some sort of hierarchy, but you do have a definite caste system in the United States society at every level. White race is definitely giving you white privilege and white advantage. And being a colored person is definitely a disadvantage and brings you to the receiving end. And it's not just, African American, it's any colored person. And a number of people in this gathering are colored people. And there have been traffic stops and other things and, insinuations just because you look different, you are not white. So it shows in all spheres of the society. Black Lives Matter was a counter reaction to systematic biases in the US law enforcement, which led to a situation with all the examples you have talked about. Police could enter your apartment and shoot you because they are looking for drugs and kill you. This has happened. Police could enter the apartment of an African American male and shoot that person, saying that you are an intruder in my apartment, when the police officer was intruder in that person's apartment. There has been militarization of the police force in the United States. Pretty much in each country, military does not handle law and order, including in this. but there's de facto militarization of the police force. The police force does not need armored vehicle carriers, but most of them have. So there is need for retraining of the police force, sensitivity training, cultural sensitivity and racial sensitivity training, diversification in recruitment. And time has come, rather than just having consent decrees, have some centralized recruitment of the police officers. Because you may be a federal country, but you cannot allow this kind of thing and just say it's not my responsibility, police are recruited locally, so I am the president of the country, but I cannot do anything about it. There is need for self-introspection in US establishment. Instead of thumping chest and beating chest that other countries are doing human rights violations, when you are doing human rights violations blatantly, left, right, and center. And Hardam, you went through Obama presidency, Trump presidency, and now Biden presidency. I don't see any substantial improvement. When Obama presidency started, we had a famous beer conference. You remember that beer conference? In which president and vice president of the country invited a police officer who assaulted a professor who entered his own house, and police officer arrested him saying that you are an intruder. So, and what happened during Trump presidency and what's happening now, I think this is reflection of what is overall going on in society, and these trends have to be checked. Because there are definite biases, although no party is like without any agenda or without any, biases. Coming into the international aspects, Professor Nanda very, wisely mentioned that there are very limited legal resources in the United States. And he gave the possibility, and maybe the human rights organizations need to give that option, explain that option to the communities of color that have been oppressed and persecuted in the United States, that you have those options in Inter-American Union, all that sort of thing. But can you imagine a magistrate sitting in Portugal or Spain where they have the concept of extraterritorial jurisdiction, calling up a governor of the United States for failing to bring justice to Black community? Is that an option? Both Portugal and Spain have invoked the concept of extraterritorial jurisdiction. Put somebody, a smart young lawyer, bring a case using the doctrine of extraterritorial jurisdiction.
Yes, they can.
You live in an internet era when there is, large transnational syndicates exposing crime, whether it is Panama Papers or something like that. So could a syndicate of young lawyers start bringing cases in countries where they allow extraterritorial jurisdiction for prosecution of errant US officials? I'm throwing a challenge to you, Hardam.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes, they actually do that right now. And they do it all the time. And we all know that. It's called international law, which is why I would love to hear Dr. Nanda and Dr. Andiji's perspectives on it and really go further. And, examples of this happen all the time. International tax. You look at international immigration, you look at international criminal issues. what we just saw in Ukraine, where you know, in Russia going on with war crimes, where a Russian officer was brought into Ukraine. That's you know, international, you know, jurisdiction, and that is all called civil procedure. But when you put it in the international sense, it becomes criminal as well. So it's a very unique area of law, and I probably know this much compared to what Dr. Nanda knows and what Dr. Arindaji knows. So I would love to kind of hear their perspectives. So I will actually spit it back at you, because each different issue is, that answer could be very different, each different jurisdiction.
I am asking about a very specific question. Can a US official be prosecuted in Spain or Portugal for, you know, letting go, because a number of prosecutors have just winked at the police officers, and police officers who have killed Black US citizens have gone scot-free.
So the answer is no. The answer is no. But if you had a good lawyer, that's what I'm trying to say. It could be yes. And that's what I said, yes.
That is why I'm saying that, you know,
Yes.
always there's a case law that is.
There's case law, yes. Yes, sir.
There's a case law. They may not be a settled law,
but there's case law. It is what a system of nations has agreed to based on treaties, based on international agreements, and that is ultimately what happens. And the case law in the court of public opinion, international opinion is what I always call it, works out, because no government wants to disrupt the other if they're a part of the civil nations of the world.
Okay, so it has been very productive discussion, and I like the candor and the openness with which we discuss these issues.
Doctor, was that correct though? Could you kind of explain that, what I said? I would like to know what your thoughts were on that, if we have one more minute of your insights.
I think we will discuss it later on.
All right.
But let's finish this seminar. I thank everyone, starting with Mr. Ripudaman Pachauri. Great research, very compact, powerful presentation based on facts. Thankful to Professor Nanda and thankful to Mr. Tripathi, our Director of Legal and Policy Affairs, for very, very, you know, illustrated discussion of the problems we are facing. But ultimately, the onus lies on US society to change itself to correct these wrongs, which are based on racial biases. Thank you, everyone. We shall meet next week for our next seminar series, which Anushri will present. And till that time, bye-bye.
It was great meeting you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
All right.